Okay, here we are. Counted 1, 2, 3. Yep, we're recording. Cool. So perhaps for a round of introductions at the beginning, could you tell me a little bit about your current role or job title and what does it mean?
Okay, great. I am an associate professor at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and I am also a UNESCO chair in open education and social justice. So, open education and social justice kind of drives the work that I do and the research that I do. Although I am also very involved in teaching postgraduate students. And one of the aspects that aligns quite nicely with this particular interview and research is we have just completed, we're in the final week of a Designing with AI short course that we developed at the University of Cape Town that's purely online. And we're just finishing up that now. It's 6 weeks long.
All right, exciting stuff. And actually on this topic, now that you mentioned you were working with AI, let's start off with what do you call AI? What does AI mean to you?
So we talk a lot about the large language models and generative AI kind of, I think, quite interchangeably. We're not, I would say, we're not data scientists. We're not very technical. We're looking at what AI can do for education and in learning design and the contexts that we're involved in. So I don't think our definitions would be very technical, but definitely large learning models and very interested in how they are trained and thinking about ethical issues and other issues around AI.
Hmm. So, okay, in that case, when we are talking about AI for the rest of the conversation, I guess I'll be thinking of AI models that can produce some outputs. So, as you mentioned, there's large language models, but I suppose image generation or maybe sound
Yes,
generation would apply as well.
yes.
Hmm. Okay, cool. And then on the other hand, you mentioned that you were using this for open learning. And I suppose in the broad sense, if we talk about open education, what does open mean to you in that context?
So open in the sense of open education is around accessible materials and practices with a strong emphasis on attribution and Creative Commons licenses so that materials and practices and so on are available to others to use and change and so on, but very strongly aligned with principles of attribution and accessibility.
Mhm. So accessibility in the sense of being able to access by particular groups, or I suppose this word can have many meanings too.
So accessibility, there's definitely two sides, especially with students in South Africa. So the idea of saving money and that side of the resources is important, but also accessibility in terms of um, things like, are students able to access the materials? Are they printable? Are they available online? Are there versions of it that could be downloaded and so on? So there's also that whole level of accessibility as well, which open education resources allows for. So it can be digital under certain circumstances, it can be printed out and so on. So that gives that increased aspect about accessibility.
Hmm. I see. And between attribution and accessibility, what is the connection that makes them both aspects of openness?
So open, is if you have to look at the opposite, so it's open versus closed. And we know that there's a continuum in between. And so if we're thinking about resources, teaching materials, textbooks, and so on, about sharing those. If we share them, if we simply put them online, they're still under copyright. They actually need to be licensed with a Creative Commons license for them to be properly shareable and openly available. And so that's where, for me, still really wedded to the licensing idea, because it gives you that continuum between something that is open, that is public domain, which is also obviously wonderful. But if you're an author, you also can have attribution, as opposed to closed under full copyright, where there's limited access to that information.
Mm-hmm. Right. And as we think about the open-closed continuum, you mentioned that it's not necessarily fully open or fully closed, I suppose, but it can be somewhere in between. So would it be right then to say that if something is published online, it is a little bit open because it's more accessible than it not being online, but then it could be more open by having an open license applied.
Yes.
I see. Okay. And when it comes to defining open education as a whole, would it, I suppose, is then accessibility and attribution all of it? Does that encompass all aspects of open education to you?
So no. So what we've been doing at the University of Cape Town, which is kind of aligned with my chair, is to look at the social justice role of open education. And when we look at the social justice role, we kind of have these dimensions that we consider. So we do look at the economic, which would be the cost saving, and the idea of access to digital, etc. So there's an economic dimension, but that is only one aspect. The other aspects are very strong enablers to overcome injustice. And so what we think about when we think about creating open content, open education resources, or open textbooks, is that we need to make the content culturally relevant. And so we see a real power in creating our own resources that mean something to the students, that represent their lived realities, where they, as their cultures, they're actually recognized in those materials. So that's a very sort of powerful next level. It's not taking an open textbook from the US, for example, and bringing it in to South Africa. That's great. It's open. Students can access it without paying money. It's not going to be as relevant. So what we're trying to promote is this idea of creation of open materials, but to think about the economics, to think about the cultural relevance, but then to also think about representation. So kind of the political level, which is all about voice. So if we're authoring new materials, who's authoring those materials? How can you bring in marginalized, you bring in students to co-create those materials? And in so doing, what you do is, in the process of creating open materials, you're bringing in all those aspects, and making the material so much more relevant. So the student comes into the class, has access to the material. They all have the textbook. Amazing to walk into a classroom. Everybody has access to it, but it also has local examples that they can really relate to. It might also be translated. So translation is also something that's the multilingualism aspect. That's also a key thing with AI in the future. And in many cases, it can be co-created or reviewed by students, or worked with a number of different groups to actually make the materials more relevant. So yes, so to me, open education is way more than the cost, but in a global South setting, cost is still very important. Students cannot afford the textbooks. So it's still a very relevant part of the whole kind of argument for openness is the fact that it does save students money.
Mhm. I see. So I suppose if we try to connect it all into one thread, relevance, would it be right to say that it's also in a shape of accessibility, but it's beyond being able to access the content, but more from the end user's perspective, being able to make sense of the content meaningfully. Hmm. Okay.
Yes,
So,
there's a lot about language in there as well, and a lot about how it's a lot about pedagogical design in there as well, in that kind of accessibility. So we've had educators, for example, who've created chapters in mathematics, and what they've done is they've thought very carefully about the language. So it's still in English, um, but we're very aware that we have a lot of students that are second or third language English speakers. So they're coming into something like mathematics. They have some English, but it's not perfect at all. Plus, they now have to embrace this whole mathematical discourse, super complicated, like, really tricky. And so we've got some fantastic authors who are trying to make the maths language more accessible to help students to come into those, to understanding those concepts. And part of the way of doing that has been to use students who have been through the course, who have had these struggles, and therefore are able to sort of unpack some of the concepts that are, really difficult for students to comprehend, especially if you're not first language English.
mhm, I see. Okay. Well, that I think gives us a good idea of what open education in general represents. So now bringing back a conversation to AI as we think about generative AI models and open education as accessible content in the different meanings of accessible, what would open AI in education mean?
So real open AI, not the open AI that's bantered around, that's not open, would mean that in the sense of kind of an open source software kind of approach, would mean that all aspects of the AI was visible in terms of how was the AI trained, um, what are the models and what are the weightings and how are the weightings designed. Those would make the whole process more open. And at the moment, it's not open. So it's not really clear how these models are being trained. That's not information. We just know that they've trained on copyright material, Creative Commons material, news, a whole range of different materials. And that doesn't feel comfortable when your philosophy in open education is about careful attribution and this kind of respect of the sharing idea, that kind of underlying philosophy of social justice. So at the moment, this kind of open AI is using open in the incorrect way. So if I had to imagine open AI or future open AIs, I would be thinking of something like having those components really openly available in terms of how the AI is trained, how it's trained, but also the models, mathematical models, and so on around how it's trained, so that no matter where you come to the AI, you are able to, it's transparent. So I don't need to know all the technical stuff. That's not my skill, but I would like to know where the models are trained. And I would like to be able to think about, how we can move forward with that in terms of attribution and working forward. Um, there were two things that I've heard interestingly recently. One was a talk at Open Ed, the conference that was recently held in America, and the keynote speaker from OpenStax talked about attribution hell. And I do feel like it's a scary space at the moment. And I mean, I know this is why you're doing the research. We're in a fuzzy stage of trying to understand exactly where we are. And we don't know yet, and we might only know in a couple more years' time, how this copyright, attribution, Creative Commons, all of that, how that's all going to work to come out in the future. And somebody else suggested, and I must admit, I can't remember who it was, of talking about a place that is an open AI, that is a portal, or however we design the actual thing, where open educators go and say, you can train your AI on my stuff. And it's like an AI Commons, I think somebody called it, where there's that sharing aspect to it. And you say, this, I want you to train your AI on these particular things, and go for it. And I think that I think we need to think of those kinds of models where we can kind of train AI on the materials we want AI to be trained on. There's a big aspect of that bias, and especially with the global south, that AI models are generally trained on more global north materials because they are probably more readily available anyway. But that ends up with, when you do, prompt these models, you need to really guide the prompt to make sure what you're getting is more representative and not a kind of typical white, male, Western dominated discourse. Sorry, I'm not
Well,
picking
that
on you,
really
prompts.
links into the relevance aspect that you mentioned,
Mm,
right? About
mm.
whether something's open or not depends from the end user's perspective, whether they can access it, but later can they meaningfully make sense of it. And so I see how that comes in as an aspect of relevance to whoever is using it. And just to, I suppose, probe a bit at the edges, something that came up as you were explaining, I noticed was the element of respect. Um, and is that something that is part of the meaning of open, or is it like something that goes together with open?
I think it's a combination of open and academic integrity. But I feel that openness is built on principles of academic integrity. There's they align very well. And I think that is one of the kind of pillars, this kind of idea of, if you have principles of academic integrity, there are principles around respect and trust, and yeah, those kind of reciprocity and being responsible, and all those kinds of aspects are kind of built into that. My version of open includes that academic integrity, and I think all open educators will say that it's very important.
Hmm. And then also to probe in another aspect, you mentioned part of OpenAI is transparency, and really sharing how an AI model was trained, what's a process for doing so. And so I'm wondering if accessibility is a part of being open. I suppose it matters how this is explained too. Having the exact technical and mathematical definition of how the model was trained might still be inaccessible for many audiences. So would this be something that is only like partially open in that it is available, but not completely open because many people can't make sense of it?
Yes, I think so. I mean, this is training large language models is the world of data scientists. As far, I mean, I can see the most incredible uh, examples in Africa of startups that are doing this kind of work where they are, developing their own large language models and training them on African data sets, on African languages. And it's very technical stuff. It's not, it's not the normal person is not going to be able to understand that. But I think that's still having, understanding the background will enable more people, more data scientists, more computer scientists, and so on, to be able to develop AI in directions that they want. So I'm picturing kind of if you can make things more open, you will end up with kind of, let's say, smaller LLMs that are trained on specific data, as opposed to, what OpenAI is trying to achieve with ChatGPT is just take stuff from everywhere. So if we understood that a little bit better and we could do more kind of customized, and that is starting to happen now. I mean, there are definitely already apps that you can train on, and very easy to do chatbots. That's exciting because then you've got the authors in there, what you're dealing with, that you're not going to get hallucinations and you're not going to have somebody's work stolen. So I think openness generally, I mean, it's the same with, if we think about open education as encompassing all open, as encompassing open source, open access, open data, open science, open education resources, all the opens. Ideally, we would like to have that open. So I might not be an open science expert, but I can understand the point of it and the direction it's going. But I don't need to understand necessarily the technical side of those kinds of repositories. So I think the openness is when you need to be open in certain directions, or to certain aspects of it. That kind of, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it really highlights that on this continuum between closed and open, maybe 100% open isn't what we're going for. We're going for something that is sufficiently open.
Mm.
Hmm. Right. And
And I
I
think
suppose,
that's always been it's often nice to say, the default should be open. But that's not that, and obviously there have been a lot of people in open education that have argued very strongly for that. But there are also, as we know, many cases where that is not, that having a CC BY license is not the right thing to do. Let's say medical course materials, for example, they need to be kept as a whole. So then they need no derivatives. So I think it's also about, again, respect, but also about that the author can choose. Whereas at the moment with open AI and the way a lot of AI is being trained, the author doesn't have any rights or anything anymore.
mhm.
Interesting world that we live in. Very
Indeed.
interesting.
Yeah, okay. So the element of respect also incorporates some choice, perhaps self-determination about whether people would like to participate or not. Mhm. Okay. And I'm also thinking about the article that you shared,
Okay.
about the use of digital open textbooks at the University of Cape Town. Is this an example of open AI to you?
So I just shared that one example, which was a case study, and one of the few experiments that we've done with the kind of juxtaposition of open education and students and ChatGPT as part of a mini course. I thought it was quite a nice little case study to share. We haven't yet used AI extensively in any other open material creation. And this was done last year, so sort of before more later versions and so on, and we were still kind of, I think we've learned so much. We have to learn all the time about AI as everything changes so quickly. But this was just a really nice example of students using ChatGPT to create open textbook chapters as part of a module. So they were marked, actually were assessed for doing this. And then being a little kind of thrown in the deep end by the lecturer. The lecturer is very, very kind of open-minded, very much students as co-creators, kind of his whole thought process is about how powerful the students are. And then looking at how kind of what the AI literacy of the students we were really impressed with, because they were very critical of what they had. They were afraid, first of all, because they didn't want to, of plagiarism and all kinds of other things. So that they were very scared of getting into trouble for using ChatGPT, but they were also very critical. And he assessed the project on not the actual content, but the conversation with ChatGPT. So the students kept they had an initial prompt, and then they kept all the subsequent prompts that they had to kind of, come down, check references and so on, and the whole process that they did. So I thought it was a great example of what AI could be used for. But as the lecturer said, it was a bit of a double-edged sword in that it was super quick, obviously, to create the chapter, but not necessarily of better quality. So you still needed the expert to check it. The students still needed to go through the process of, if there were references, were the references correct? So it was it was great because it was so quick, because normally it would have taken, 6 months or longer to produce this chapter. Because he'd been through the process before of creating chapters before using AI. So definitely quicker, not necessarily good in better quality, but also other things like these were third-year students. He said maybe if they were fifth-year students, medical students, they would have been more critical. So it brought up lots of interesting kind of topics and questions about how to do this with students. But it does show the potential of creating open materials, but certainly still needs expertise, still needs working through and being critical. But to get to that first draft, that's pretty exciting.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think that now I better understand this is a case study that showcases one example of
Mhm.
openness, of, I guess, collaboration in creating open materials.
Yes.
But as we've discussed, openness as a whole also has different other facets. So I guess this is open in some ways and not open in others. All right. As we come to the end of the half hour, I'm aware that this is the time we have allocated initially for the interview. I do have
Okay.
a few more questions, but I wanted to ask, do you have time for them?
I have a few more minutes. Yeah. I think,
Okay.
my next meeting is I've got another 15 minutes.
Okay, let's wrap up in 15 minutes then. So one thing I wanted to ask you about is when we think of open AI and as open as possible, so highly accessible and relevant to the target audience, and I suppose not only available, but also affordable. And it respects the choices of the content creators if content was used, and it's possible to find out how this was trained. So open in all the different ways. how do you perceive the role of such open AI in enhancing education?
That's a big question. um, so if I have to put the open education hat on, certainly it has potential to create resources in parts of the world where there are enormous resource constraints. And if I have to look at, let's say, as South African examples or perhaps African examples, if we have this kind of open AI in these, and then that's also the trick, is that they need to be free versions, so they can't be the paid for versions, and that's a very important caution that we have to keep in mind. We don't want to increase the digital divide by having these models costing money. Our students are only using the free versions. We don't have any provisos or any licenses or anything for anything else. They can only use the free version. But I think open AI, there's so many options. So if we think about large language models, we can talk about prompts and things, but there's also so much affordance now for audio as well. So and translation. And this is for me the most exciting thing, is that you can be a first language speaker of a language that only has a few thousand people that speaks that language, and the way you've been brought up is that you tell stories, so you have oral histories. You don't necessarily write these things down. And what AI can bring to those kinds of situations is now this ability to speak your language, and have it translated and have it actually recorded. So there are those kinds of possibilities, especially. So if we're talking about education, obviously my setting is higher education, but if we're talking about like about small children who are not literate, and education is a huge issue in the global south, and across the world we have situations, different countries that have varying levels of education. But if we're talking about younger children who cannot write, but they can speak, and they have their language, there's quite a few interesting options there that we've never had before, where we can actually get those children to be speaking, and learning through kind of more audio to help them to get to better literacy levels. So I think there's an enormous amount of potential there. And that's always top of mind for me, is thinking about the global south and the global north, and trying to increase access to those specific marginalized communities that don't have access to education in the same way. And open education has always been suggested as a way to help those marginalized communities. But if they're getting resources in French or English, or the kind of typical Chinese or whatever it is, they don't understand those resources. But if we can translate those using AI, that's going to open up, I think, all kinds of very interesting opportunities in the future, of bringing more equity in education.
All
I know
right.
pie in the sky, but that's my kind of dream. I think that's very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose now we have an image of the dreamland we would like to get to and where we are now. And in between, I'm curious, do you see any challenges that might come up in implementing OpenAI, getting to that dream state, something we need to tackle first?
So I suppose there's this ongoing challenge of big tech monopolies, who will try and make as much money out of whatever they can. And here we're talking about the Microsofts and the Googles and the OpenAIs and those big tech monopolies that would stand in the way of this kind of thing. They are, whether you like it or not, you're using Teams. You've got Copilot. You're kind of drawn in even without knowing it, and get sucked in because it's free, but it's not really free, right? You're giving away your data. There's a whole complex discussion around that. And I do think that would be a huge challenge, and those big tech companies will be standing in the way of opening up so that smaller, more niche LLMs and those kinds of this kind of dream versions are going to be more difficult to implement. So I think that's a very big challenge. Yeah, one of the major challenges, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, do you know of any emerging trends or developments? I remember you mentioned there are some small startups, for example, in Africa developing their own models. Do you see any other trends that will influence OpenAI in the future?
I think, yeah, I think because if you're in a resource constrained environment, you have to be almost more creative and more ingenious in how you find solutions, because you don't have access to the money and the kind of easy way of doing things with lots of resources, right? I mean, we'd all love to have more resources, but we don't have them. And because of that, I think that does spark more creativity and this need to have open AI models or open education that is locally focused, so context specific. And that to me is, we have to think of our contexts. We want to think broader. I mean, if I'm thinking about South Africa, if I'm thinking about my university, what needs to happen here for my students as they go out into the world, the context is very important, as opposed to kind of the whole of Africa, which sometimes I kind of try and think about, but I mean, it's impossible because it's so varied. So I think that the kind of context-specific creativity is coming through, and I'm hoping that's going to be a trend. I was at a conference recently called Transforming Knowledge for Africa's Futures, which is a UNESCO conference. And I was so amazed by that. It's, I knew of the one example where they were doing this work in translation, but it's not the only one. There are many already. So I think there will be those trends. It's how leaders in these kind of open worlds, in the AI open world, how that's going to also emerge to bring those to the fore, so that people can actually collaborate and network. That's always a challenge as well. We know this, sometimes work in silos and don't work together enough. Would also be a challenge.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then on the way to the utopian OpenAI future, where we can have context-specific models that people can use for their own use cases, I wonder, are there any risks that you foresee associated with the use of OpenAI in education? Is there a way that we can get it wrong by going too open, for example?
Um, definitely. I mean, the risks. So this also comes back to the big tech discussion. The risks of putting your content. So if it's your content, you have to take responsibility for it. But in a university, we've also got students' work. And, you know, that the risk there is we want to protect our students from this. If I decide I want to make my materials public domain, that's my decision, and whoever can use them wherever they want to use them. But there are circumstances like our students, we need to protect their work from being taken into these kinds of models. So I think there are those risks to privacy. There are the risks around ethics, and I think it's a constant ongoing conversation around how to think about ethical frameworks, think about mitigating the risks of vulnerable communities being exposed, being used. These are not necessarily new conversations because of big tech already doing these things. You know, our information is already being used. Sometimes, you know, we just don't read those terms and conditions. Um, so it's not like it's suddenly a new set of risks, but it is a kind of more, it's a greater risk now with AI, I think, even more difficult to be able to protect vulnerable people and vulnerable communities.
I see. That's something we'll definitely have to watch out for. Okay, so as we come to time, thank you very much for sharing your insights. And as we
Thank
wrap up,
you.
is there anything else you'd like to add or discuss that we haven't covered?
I don't think so. I think that, you know, as the months unfold, we're going to be learning more. So it's a very exciting research project, but you might have to do this again in like 3 months time. And I think everyone that you interview is we're learning along the way. Oh, and this is not part of our core jobs. This is one aspect of the job. But I think the open education AI conversation is, you know, it's close to my heart and very important. So it's essential, but it's also, yeah, it's a lot to take in. But I think, yeah, 3 months' time might be a little bit of a different story.
That's fair. That's fair. So we'll keep the conversations going. Thank
Great.
you very much, and I'll
Brilliant.
stop the recording
Okay,
here.
great.
All right.